Hello, everybody. We are now live. Great to see you all, or at least know that you're there. I see the viewer count starting to increase here a little bit. I'm Daniel Akeridge. This is the CUI Hotline. You notice a way better looking individual on the call today. Jacob Horn is out on PTO today. So we have the one and only Fernando joining us today. C3PAO extraordinaire, gone through, gosh, I don't even know how many assessments and certifications at this point, Fernando, but we've got an actual expert assessor on the line. We're going to take all of your questions today on the CUI hotline. Fernando, how you been?
Busy. So like you said, we just concluded our 61st assessment this morning. So
wow, congratulations.
Slowly getting up there.
That's incredible, man. I mean, the fact, so you started even on the joint surveillance days, right? Towards the middle to end of last year. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. I think before the joint surveillance program had ended, we had completed about 15 JSVAs. And then since January until now, we're up to 61 CMMC level 2 assessments.
Man, that's incredible. It's interesting to see the numbers of, like, I think was it over 300 now CMMC L2 certs? I think is what CyberAD is reporting, or close to it.
Yeah, I think the last town hall was like 366 CMMC level 2 final certs, and I think it was under 20 CMMC level 2 conditional certs have been done.
Okay, wow. So it's fun to see those numbers increasing, and then your percentage being so high, 61. We've now have 54 clients that have gotten certified. It's like between the two of us, obviously we've had a lot of overlap. That's almost half, you know? Yeah. So we're not doing too bad here. So man, crazy. Well, one thing we do, and my apologies to the viewers, I sent Fernando the wrong link to do the live stream. So he was sitting in a lobby that was completely empty. Normally, Fernando, we do these things called week in reviews. So it's a major thing that you kind of learned, or a story that you heard this week about CMMC and the ecosystem. I'm not going to give that to you right now. I'm going to leave it blank for now. I'm going to do mine, give you some time to think about it, and then we'll come back to you, and then we'll get to all the live questions in chat.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, Daniel's weekend review. I get a meeting scheduled on my calendar for, I think it was 10:30 yesterday morning. And I'm like, oh, this has a Japanese domain registry to it. I was like, this will be interesting. And it was this gentleman right outside Tokyo that worked for a small manufacturer that was like, you know, hey, I hear I need to do CMMC. I was like, okay, this was an IT guy. He was the IT director of one of their plants. He's like, I need to do CMMC. I was like, that's great. I was like, do you have any US addresses? And they're like, no. I was like, well, we got some conundrums on our hands, because one of the easiest ways to get compliant is leveraging GovCloud services, but a lot of those require you to have a cage code associated to a valid US address to become eligible for. And so then we started kind of going down the conversation of, you know, how do they do it on-prem, manufacturers? How do you do an enclave in a manufacturing environment? And we spent probably 30, 45 minutes kind of working through this conversation. And then it's like, hey, like, can you guys even assess me? Right? It's like, I'm an international company. You know, is Japan okay with your boys coming over here and doing a certification on us? And I was like, well, there is no reciprocity between other nations. Like right now, the only way to do it is to hire a C3PO. I think there's maybe one or two assessors outside of the United States, I think I heard at this point. Yeah. I don't know if any of them are in Japan, but it's such a small amount. You likely have to hire somebody from the US. So a couple questions for you out of the gate, Fernando, and then I'll get to my second thing, which is about Huntington Ingalls rollout. Is number one, are there Japanese assessors? If so, what does that look like? Or if they're not, what does that look like? Do you go to Japan? I mean, you probably wouldn't hate it. And what does that look like from like international companies trying to do CMMC without the FedRAMP ability, because they don't have access to gov resources here stateside? So throwing a couple at you rapid fire, actually.
Yeah. So I'm not aware of any Japanese C3PAOs or even assessors for that point. Okay. But there is a little bit of a wrinkle here, and there are things called N cage codes.
And cage codes. Okay.
Yeah, N as in November cage codes, and they function the same as a US based company cage code. And those are provided by NATO support in the procurement agency. And it's the same 5-digit alphanumeric system, and will work in EMAS and SPRS, to my knowledge, is what we've been told.
Fascinating. So there's a separate associate, well, kind of the same, but separate association with what an international company would go through.
Right. And it's interesting because it's provided by the NATO Support and Procurement Agency, and somehow or another, it's actually tied with SPRS. So I learned about that myself probably about 2 weeks ago.
Wow. Okay. So international companies have a little bit of a different system. The structure of certification remains the same. Do you know if countries are open to US persons assessing, their defense contractors, I'll call it?
At this time, I don't know. We're still waiting on that guidance. I think we heard back in April at Seek West, Stacy Bostjanek talk about international partners and kind of like that process that had to go through with like C3PAOs and international entities. But other than that, right to your point, there's no reciprocity at the moment.
Fascinating. Okay, well, good to know. It's so tricky because in the DoD, in the CMMC FAQs on the CIO's website, when it calls out international, it says, "Listen, guys, just do the same. Like you don't get special treatment. You just got to do what we said." And it's like I haven't seen FedRAMP exemptions for them either, which makes everything very difficult for international companies.
And also, like I think to your point, in the 32 rule under the comments and responses, there's a comment there on how will CMMC apply to international partners, and the response that DoD gave was essentially just like anything else, you would just flow down the requirements to them, which a lot easier said than done, as we're starting to figure out.
100%. And I think a lot of people don't. It's interesting when you mix policymakers with boots on the ground, like conversations, because it's like there's a little bit of a disconnect here. We're not fully completing the picture together. Speaking of pictures, I've got a little something. This has made the rounds on LinkedIn the last day or so. Huntington Ingalls, basically their timeline for CMMC and their supply chain. It's kind of interesting. Have you seen this, Fernando?
I just saw this earlier today.
Yeah.
For the first time.
This, when I saw it on LinkedIn and Jacob messaged it to me, he's like, "Hey, have you seen this?" I'm like, "Yeah." I was like, "Okay, here we go. Let's look at this." So CMMC level 2 self-assessments, Q2 into a little bit of Q3 of 2025, level 2 certifications in Q4, and then phase 2 CMMC certifications and new contracts. I keep looking at this and I'm like, are they referring to like what was the fiscal year but even the DoD fiscal year just started for 26. So maybe that isn't the case. I don't know. I was looking at this and I'm like, oh my gosh, their suppliers are going to immediately get hit with CMMC level 2 certifications.
Yeah.
Like Huntington Ingalls actually is following this.
Timeline. Like right now.
Right now. Like I'm looking at the box. I'm like, we're in that Q4 dark blue CMMC cert window.
Yep. And actually, speaking of which, I actually had someone call me yesterday, and we got on a call, and he's like, I just got this email from Leonardo DRS, and he showed me the same exact memo that we've been seeing on them. And he's like, and I got to get this done. Asking questions like, who's managing your environment? Where our MSP is supposed to be handling this? And I go, do you have a system security plan? He's like, what's that? I'm like,
we were at CS2. I don't know I think you were around when we were having the conversation. I think it was a different assessor said their little expectation was for us to show up and just ask them some interview questions, and they didn't have to produce any documentation. I'm like, do you not know? Did no one show you what the cap was? Did you not do a little bit of research? Anyways, that part of the world is just kind of interesting to me because it's like, oh yeah, just call Fernando up. He'll just show up, our Zoom call, ask you like a dozen questions, give you a thumbs up, and you're on your way. It's like, that's not exactly how that works.
Yeah. And of course, I was asking questions about, wanting to take a look at their system security plan, policies, and procedures. This guy had nothing to even show me. So I said, well, we're going to have to reschedule this call because I can't do anything for you right now to kind of see where you're at. So bring your MSP into the mix. And he said he was going to set up a call. I saw the email go out and just crickets. I think. Yeah.
They're like, no, thank you. It's like, I don't think we want to be involved in this CMMC thing anymore. And I've talked to many MSPs that have gotten out of that because the client didn't have them write it in their contract that they would support them. And so it's like a handshake deal is great up until a point until you need it. And then they have the ability to back out and leave you high and dry. We've had to kind of come in and swoop in and save the day a few times on that because it's happening more and more because MSPs, Fernando, they don't understand the burden of what it takes to do it. I mean, we've talked about this a lot. You know, you look at something like HII, I have no idea what their supply chain structure looks like. Is this 10,000 suppliers, 5,000, 20? I mean, they make ships and submarines and all the things, right? And I look at this and I'm like, they're saying you have to get certified in the next, I don't know, 65 days, basically, is what their window shows here. And there's 300, mid 300s that are certified today across every industry. You know what I mean? Not just the supply chain of HII. And you look at it, you're like, this is going to be a bloodbath, because people just genuinely aren't ready. So anyways, that was a interesting thing there.
Yeah. And we took the stance too. Like we kept getting prospects coming to us from non-certified MSPs. And we continue to keep running into the same problem that they don't seem to understand their level of involvement, shared responsibility, and so forth. So we took a hard stance and said, if a client comes to us from a non-certified MSP, we're simply not going to accept those clients.
Wow, that's fascinating. Because I mean, it's too much risk, honestly, probably for you guys saying, we don't want to take on the failure of this assessment due to I have to say the word incompetence, but incompetence of external service providers. I mean, there's really no nicer way to say that. Like, I know people are trying and I appreciate that, but at some level, you might just have to throw in the towel as an MSP and say, we just don't have capacity to do this. Because, we can't find the staff to do it. We don't want to move our tech stack around to accommodate it. Like, fill in the blank when it comes to that. So leaning into that response, I have a blank thing in here for Fernando's weekend review. Anything this week outside of the MSP thing that you'd like to highlight as something interesting?
No, I mean, that was the main thing, was that client, when one of the very few times them actually showing me that they received that memo from Leonardo DRS, and they were panicking that they were essentially not ready. And I had told him, I was like, it's interesting because he's on the other side of Florida. And I said, if you would have been here 2 days ago, I gave this same exact presentation and displayed that same exact memo at our at the Space Coast Contracting Summit. And I gave it over there. And I opened up the presentation with, when it comes to CMMC, it's akin to the 5 stages of grief. There's a lot of denial. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of bargaining, and we eventually get around to acceptance. And I think when I opened it up with that and kind of went through the entire presentation, it opened up people's eyes as to like how far along it was. Most of them didn't even note that the 48 rules about to take effect on November 10th.
Isn't that crazy? I mean, it's absolutely nuts when it comes to stuff like that. Because I think I had the call this morning, I had a couple calls this morning. And when you throw out, they're like, oh yeah, the date for CMMC. I'm like, yeah, do you know it's a real date now? They're like, oh, yeah. It's like, yeah, it's November 10th. They're like, wait, what do you mean with that? Which is interesting because there's a question actually here right out of the gate about, this is Daniel again. Hello, Daniel. Nice to see you again. Would every DIB relevant contract have a level 1 requirement FCI protection after November 10th? And in talking to Jacob and looking at the rule, like FAR 52-204-21's got to be in everything already. It's a FAR requirement.
Right.
Meaning at a minimum, because it's a FAR, not even DFAR's requirement, CMMC level 1 is going to be in there.
Yep.
Right. It's the same controls. Just the DoD wants you to literally fill in a checkbox and spurs saying, I've done CMMC level 1.
Yep.
Now the contract rollout vehicle of that with DFAR 7021 on solicitations and things like that, it'll be interesting to see how agencies incorporate that into things that are mid-flight, basically in process of award, but award not completed, and what that looks like. But yeah, from everything that Jacob's researched and him and I have talked about, level 1's going to be there November 10th and on at a minimum when it comes to this. And then self-attesting for level 2 for CUI, except for, which we've talked about the memo you just did, things around the Defense Organizational Index, right? The defense categories of CTI and DoD critical infrastructure like vulnerability information and all of that kind of stuff. So
Daniel, kind of like to your point, I think a lot of people are kind of getting into this habit that if it's in the Defense Organizational Index grouping, right, that obviously we already know that's going to be a CMMC level 2 third-party requirement.
Yep.
And that anything outside of that organizational index grouping won't allow it. But a couple, or it'll be self-assessment. But a couple of the KOs that I'm talking about, they're like, we have contractors that are handling soldiers' PII data. And although it's technically outside of the Defense Organizational Index grouping, we're probably not going to allow them to self-assess. We're probably going to want third-party verification as well.
So that is huge, because what Fernando and I are talking about, if you're unaware of this memo, and I'll drop the link here in chat. This is a way too zoomed in version of it. This is kind of the breakdown of what the memo says from a certification versus self-attestation. What Fernando just said is, I'm going to unhighlight this part, is privacy information. Although it's under a self-assess, if the DoD deems high risk, guess what they can do? They can exercise the right to then require CMMC level 2 certification. So we have the minimum of the memo, which is saying anything defense, which is the third kind of row here, put a cert on. But then we have, and I knew this was going to happen, Fernando, we have contracting officers and really program managers above them saying, hey, we want to CYA ourselves against this because we deem this as sensitive, and we're going to slap a certification requirement on it. And the way that this works, if the prime is issued a requirement to cert, they have to be certified. And then showing another fun little picture here, if I can find my mouse, as that data, that CUI specifically, flows down, that level 2 requirement of certification flows with it. And not just to you as a tier 1 suppliers or tier 2, tier 3, 4, 5. It's meant to go all the way down the supply chain. And so this is kind of the conundrum. There's going to be a lot more certification, I believe. I think from what you heard, it's very validating for a lot of CUI to be required at a CMMC level 2 certification. Because here's the thing. Only one company with a CMMC cert in your industry has to be able to deliver that, right? Now, if they have subs, their subs are also going to have to be compliant, which is where the tricky part comes in. But if I can deliver that service as a single entity and not rely on subs to be certified, I'm going to go win a crap ton of work post November 10th when these things start slipping into certification requirements. Man, it's going to get, we say all the time, it's going to be a bloodbath. Like it's going to be, and it makes me sad in part because I love small businesses. You do too, Fernando. Like, how big's your team over at CyberSec Investments now?
So I think we're up to 18 employees right now. So
it's incredible.
Yeah. So for all intents and purposes, right, we're a small business as well. And one of the things that I wanted to do in the very beginning when we decided to become a C3PAO was I wanted to prove that can a small business implement these requirements? And I was able to implement all 110 controls, 320 assessment objectives, write all my own policies and procedures by myself, went through that DIBCAC high assessment, and it took us 2.5, 3 days to get through that DIBCAC high. So I said, the notion that it can't be done is not true. It takes a lot more work because you have less resources to work with. But if they would have started, say, 3 years ago and just implementing, heck, maybe even one control a week, couple controls here and there, and just kind of take your time and spread it out, they would have been done by now.
Yeah. And that's the double-edged sword, right? It's like, I feel and have empathy for businesses because they're like, I could either, pay my employees this pay period or pay for CMMC. It's like one of those two pieces of tension. The DoD is so upset because the DoD is like, you've been signing contracts saying you've been doing this for years. The DoD hasn't done a great job of enforcing things like minimum SPUR scores, like leveling up year over year, saying this is the minimum now, this is the minimum now. I would have loved to have seen something like that. That didn't happen. I mean, I know people that got awarded contracts with a negative 203 score, which is the lowest SPUR score you can have. It basically says you've done nothing.
Zero.
And so it's like, but then you have the other side of it, right? Where it's like the DoD's upset at the small business, and the small business is like, we don't have any money, right? It's like, you guys, DoD, take the lowest price, technically accepted LPTA contracts all the time without validating cyber hygiene. And like, what are we to do? When my gizmo costs me $2 extra because I've burdened on the DFARS 7012 requirement and you guys don't pick me, then I don't have a business. Yep. And so now what we're going to see is a lot of acquisition of the supply chain, sadly, because the small businesses that didn't A, think it was going to happen, or B, never wanted to budget for it, and now they're going to miss opportunities. I mean, how long can you go for 6 months without a contract award? That's on the low end about how long it will take you to go through, implement, document, and find an assessor that can certify you. I mean, Fernando, what's your active backlog right now, or what's your queue looking like for getting somebody certified or on the books?
Yeah, our first available date right now is mid-June of next year.
Wow, that is wild. Because I mean, that's crazy. Can your business survive if something were to start now until mid-June? You know, I mean, that's a really big risk.
And we're trying, we're trying to hire more assessors, but again, right, it's such a long process of getting the assessors through CCP training, CCP,
tier 3 suitability.
Tier 3 is the single linchpin on what's keeping a lot of like us, you know, booking out assessors even more, is waiting for tier 3, which is a 3 to 6 month, if not longer process. I've heard C3POs waiting for tier 3s for about 1.5 years.
Tier 3 is basically an enhanced background check, we'll call it for the sake of this, that the DoD does to validate, or the cyber, I guess the DoD actually issues the tier 3 suitability, but
yeah, the DoD issues.
Yeah. That's nuts, man. It's like everyone's trying to help the industry, but at the same time, there's some bottlenecks there that are just kind of hard to get around, quite honestly. And government shutdowns don't help things like tier 3 suitability, because no one's on the keyboard clicking the button to review people's information.
Yeah.
All right, let's get to some questions here. John, hey guys, what is the likelihood that we would see MSPs being required to have certifications during the 4-year rollout, as well as dropping the class deviation for R3? Any info or gut feelings? So the good news and bad news is they'd have to update 32 CFR to build in the requirements for MSPs to be certified. Is there a plan for that to happen? We have not heard that. We obviously know the intent of the DoD based on the proposed rule, that they wanted this to happen, right? And even before that in conversations. And then they dropped any level of that requirement and just said, hey, consider the MSP part of your corporate environment, right? In the sense of they are an extension of you. They're going to be assessed along with you, but don't have to independently hold a certification. I don't see them doing any kind of modifications until they do the uplift of the Rev 3 requirement of NIST 800-171. They're going to, because rulemaking takes so long, as we all know now, thanks to Jacob, I don't see them doing just the MSP portion certified and then adding on an R3 later. I think in the next, 3 years, when CMMC level, or 3.0 comes out, I think both of those things will probably be addressed, would be my gut feeling. Because at that point, there's a lot of MSPs. I mean, out of the 350-ish or so certified companies, I would say, I think like 20 or 30 of those on the minimum are MSPs, right? And so they're certified already, trying to be proactive, to Fernando's point, to show clients that they're ready to take them through an assessment and be their partner through it when a C3PO assessment occurs. Any feedback on there, Fernando?
Yeah, I mean, like we know the 32 rule got rid of, from the 32 rule, when it was during the comment period, required MSPs to get level 2 certified. And then I guess there was some backlash that eventually the DoD eventually stated, well, you don't have to get certified, but if you choose to want to get certified, it would help reduce your level of effort during the course of the assessment for that contractor. And so a lot of the MSPs, some of the leading MSPs in the space, decided to lean forward and just say, we're going to get level 2 certified ourselves to demonstrate not only our compliance, but as well as to demonstrate to the customers to kind of provide that level of assurance.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's a good, what do you call it? Virtue signal, right? It's like, hey, we're good. We're good for this. All right. Moving on to the next one here. We got Nicholas. We interpret G code for an ITAR CUI order to also be ITAR CUI. If it gets uploaded and then deleted on a CNC machine, what would be expected for a third-party maintenance people doing periodic maintenance on that CNC machine? Would an acceptable use agreement and training be adequate? So this is the world, and it's funny, Fernando, it's like cutting off parts of our head here. This is the world of specialized assets, which is always fun when it comes to this. So we talk to a ton of manufacturers, a ton of people in higher ed with research equipment. Fernando, from a specialized asset perspective, going back to Nicholas's question here, what would be sufficient documentation for a third-party maintenance vendor to come and have access to that system? And in general, specialized assets, what kind of documentation are you looking for to deem that they do have a separate security policy governing those systems? Because they don't have to have all 110 controls applied, which is nice. It's a little bit of a scapegoat, which is nice, but they need to have something. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm looking at the scoping guide, right, which is like the authoritative document on how we would categorize those specialized assets. So, right, first things first, we want to document it in that asset inventory, and then documenting the asset treatment on how those assets are being managed using the contractor's risk-based security policies, procedures, and practices. Now, that being said, as long as they do that, it is not my responsibility to say whether it's good enough or not, right? I just have to say the contractor understands that system and that portion of it as well. That's why the DoD is allowing the contractor to determine that, because, right, I'm not a specialized assets professional or expert.
An OT. Yeah,
an OT. And then documenting in the network diagram. Now, in terms of, right, if that's the case and the SSP, right, we would review it. We would not assess against those controls. But the next thing that we would do is we would ask, who are you allowing, right? This now goes back to that next question. Physical protection controls. Who are you allowing into that space? And are you following your visitor policy into the space, and they're being escorted, and you're monitoring that whatever type of work that those guys are doing on those machines.
So it's like, we definitely want to see some sort of acceptable use agreement and training of those users prior to them having access to a system, even though it's a specialized asset that may or may not process CUI, depending on the window of time that they're doing maintenance on it. We kind of assume the worst case scenario that there would be CUI at the point of maintenance.
Yep, and there's a 800.171 control on that. It's one of the 3.8 or 3.10 control families. I have to go back and take a look at it, but it basically talks about maintaining that level of overview on folks that don't have logical access to those systems, which in this case, right, they wouldn't.
Right. That's interesting.
I'd have to go back and find that control. Let me find it.
All right. While you do that, I'm going to look through some other notes here, other questions. Will the government just say that subcontractors can self-certify? I think we actually answered this last week, but I want to take another pass on it while you look that up. So the answer is no. So the government, and the way that the rule is written, the contract clause saying, hey, CMMC level 1 to certify is applicable fully downstream. Any kind of exemptions of that, if you will, have to be done at a program level, not an individual contractor level. So it's at the contract level, not the contractor level. So there is no just kind of exclusion for one small piece of your critical supply chain, 10 layers deep, let's say, to not do CMMC or to have some sort of exemption applied to that. Anyways, it's kind of interesting as it goes throughout that. All right, I've got another one, Fernando, for you. This is interesting. How long did it take you to implement? So you mentioned you wanted to show from a small business perspective, hey, this is feasible, it's possible, it might be hard, but we can do it. How long was your window of time to implement and then prove to DIBCAC, which for those unaware, C3PAOs have to go through basically a CMMC pseudo DIBCAC high assessment to get certified in their environment prior to being authorized as an assessor. So it's kind of cool. They have to show that they actually have an environment that meets the same requirements as a CMMC environment they'd be assessing. So how long did it take you to go through that process, Fernando?
Yeah, so between technical implementation and documenting everything, it took me about 5 months, and that was doing about 9 to 10 hour days, Monday through Friday. Wow.
Man, so an average person part-time may be able to spend, 10 hours a week on it, something like that, 15 hours a week. We're looking at 8, 9, 10, 12 months potentially to really get that done if you can only carve out a small portion of time.
Yeah, it took as you can imagine, Daniel, the longest part was documenting everything and making sure that the policies and procedures and everything that's listed in your system security plan are all aligned with each other. Because the first thing that DIBCAC did was, well, you state this in your policy, and that's exactly where they went to next to go validate that everything in the system security plan matched.
Yeah, it's as a kid, you remember playing the matching card game? It's like, you have 8 rows of cards, you flip over, it's like apple, 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 orange. It's like, oh, we actually got to make sure that these things are aligning here, right?
Yep.
All right, Megan, longtime viewer here. What themes? Oh, you found the control?
I found the control, 376, right? So supervise the maintenance activities of maintenance personnel without required access authorization.
All right, so that goes back to Nicholas's. I'm going to pull up the comment real quick just so we can associate. This goes back to would an acceptable use agreement and training be adequate for, this is an external vendor doing maintenance on a system.
Yep. And the keyword there, right, is the personnel without required access authorization. So this is where you would perform that visitor escort to make sure that they're not taking anything or doing anything off that machine they're not supposed to.
Awesome. There you go, Nicholas. Hope that was helpful. It's great having an assessor on the phone. I'm not going to lie. This is great. We've got a lot of Fernando specific questions because people are hungry for your interpretation of some things here. Yeah. Megan, back to you. What themes of non-technical requirements / assessment objectives are you seeing companies not meeting in assessments? This is good. Where are the landmines at? What non-technical landmines are you seeing out there, Fernando?
Yeah, so big one, which should not surprise a lot of people. I know I talk about FIPS validated cryptography, but there's actually 2 pieces to that, right? There's a non-technical piece to that. The second piece is having the FIPS validated certificate on hand.
Okay.
And usually what we see is, right, we want to see a screen share of the FIPS validated cryptography that's been employed, and then the certificate to validate that the module is actually correct. A couple of other things that we're also seeing too is they'll tell us and actually I did this presentation at CS5 where for 323 on insider threat awareness training, like they identified the precursors to insider threat awareness training, but then they weren't able to demonstrate that that training was actually taken, i.e. provide a certificate. So that's another aspect. Another one that tends to fail quite a bit too is like they'll do a risk assessment and they didn't document anything. They say we do it on an annual basis and they don't have a single risk assessment they've actually documented. So those are some of the common landmines that we're seeing out there from a non-technical perspective.
How can you say you're doing risk assessments when you can't show you've done a risk assessment? It seems kind of, it seems like a little bit of a problem here.
Yep.
So for those unaware of like the certificate piece, I pulled up a website here that many of you will be familiar with. The NIST Cryptographic Module Validation Program, CMVP. So what Fernando's saying is, yeah, you've got to use FIPS validated cryptography, but you've got to prove that the cert is there as well. So I just did an empty-ended search here. You can see all of the different modules and the vendor who owns them. Now, I will say this, Fernando, and we talked to a different assessor, and they mentioned that they're accepting FIPS 140-3 right now because so many -2s are being deprecated or not issued anymore. What's your stance on, -2 FIPS versus -3? Is that a POAMable event? Is that going to prevent me from getting certified? What does that look like?
That is, let me look this up. I always get these 2 terms mixed up. I always have to go look at it. It's between temporary deficiency or enduring exception. Let me get you the right one.
Okay.
But it's one of those. Let me see here. And I'm pulling it up right here in the rule.
Because I have enduring exception here on my screen. I can share if it ends up being this one.
It is. Yeah, so it's not the enduring exception. It's the temporary deficiency. Right. So the temporary deficiency would be, and the way that you would address this would be as such. So you implement your firewall with FIPS validated cryptography, and then something outside of your control happens, i.e. critical vulnerability comes in that states, hey, if you don't patch this right, you risk an intrusion, through this avenue. So you patch it, but in doing so, you now invalidate your FIPS validated cryptography. And so what you would do is you would document in your POAM, right? You would conduct a risk assessment, and then you would work with the vendor on finding out when the next FIPS iteration validation will come through. And then eventually what you would do is you would roll back to that FIPS validated cryptography at a later time. So theoretically speaking, you would be going in and out of FIPS the entire time because of how long it takes FIPS, the NIST CMVP to go through FIPS validation. So you might be in FIPS mode about 3 months, critical vulnerability comes out, you patch it, you're in the latest and greatest, the next one comes out, you'll then have to roll back. And as long as you're able to demonstrate that, that would then be the temporary deficiency and you would not get dinged for that during an assessment.
All right, I've got a question for you, because potentially if FIPS is not enabled, I could actually have more assets in scope than when FIPS is enabled. Because when FIPS, so what would that look like? So if I don't have that encryption mechanism on my firewall, and for some reason I'm sending HTTP traffic and not HTTPS over TLS, could I have more assets in scope? Would that actually change my CMMC UID and the assets that I maybe now have more CUI assets in scope or SPA assets because FIPS isn't enabled?
Yeah, it could potentially, right? Because like now it's not encrypted, right? Going outside of the boundary. So now you're pretty much contaminating everything.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing when you flip it on and flip it off. It's like, yes, the FIPS enablement is has that ability. What was the word again? I forget. The
temporary deficiency.
Temporary deficiency. But the assets surrounding it, when you turn that off, could become more in scope than they were before. So that's actually really interesting. I've not thought that through until you mentioned it. All right, moving on. I love the CUI hotline. This is so much fun, guys. All right, regarding MSPs, if they are not level 2 certified, we don't want them to be considered CUI assets, and I assume we'd have to remove their current admin access. That's part 1 of part 2. Part 2, which would allow them to get to areas that store and process CUI, correct, is a good reference to what they can do only in scope as a security protection asset.
Well, can you go back to the part 1, right? So I don't understand. So they're not going to be processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, even though they do have admin access to manage the environment. So they wouldn't necessarily be a CUI asset. When it comes to a security protection asset, however, the same requirements apply, but this is where the managed service provider and the contractor each have to, like, there's a shared responsibility there on who's going to be responsible for what. So for a non-certified MSP, the level of effort's higher because now we have to validate everything that the MSP is doing for your environment. And they're going to have to do this over and over and over again. Now, with some C3PLs kind of take a stance that they're going to validate everything 100% each single time. But what I've learned to find out is when we have level 2 certified MSPs and they're doing the same exact things for multiple companies, at that point, now I could reduce the level of effort by spot checking versus having to check everything all over again, which saves time and money for all parties involved.
Nice. So if you have a track record as an MSP of doing this and working with the C3PAO, they just, the comfort level there is there. Not that they're not assessing to the same standard, but they know the responses already, and they're going to ask you if those things have changed. And then maybe updated evidence, right? Hey, we have a screenshot from 6 months ago. Just show us another one, right? Something of that nature. One good example of this would potentially be if I'm an MSSP and I'm providing an EDR tool to you, endpoint detection and response, and that's not FedRAMP, that's a problem, right? Because that could easily be a CUI asset if it's doing sandboxing in the cloud and things of that nature. So that would be a conundrum. But I could also be an external service provider just doing SPA. So if I'm just reviewing logs are not CUI, but I might have a hosted SIEM that I'm ingesting those logs into. And then the users having access to those logs on the MSSP side would be, security protection assets, basically, in the sense of that, because they wouldn't process, store, or transmit CUI. They would just be looking at security protection data. So that's kind of an odd example, but it could kind of see both sides of what that would actually look like.
Yep.
All right. Handle 1012 or 212. Interesting name there. Any suggestions on ideal conference room layouts for companies that handle both CUI and non-CUI data to ensure compliance? And this is so interesting. So many conference rooms went to the glass, conference wall, right? People can see in. However, a little bit problematic if it's not frosted, because if I'm doing non-CUI, okay, there's a level of risk there. But if I'm doing CUI in that room, and I only have a enclave, if you will, very restricted users that can see it, well, I've got this big glass wall that everyone can look. I'm in a fishbowl, right? So
yeah.
Fernando, what are your recommendations from like an enclave perspective or part of the org's in scope, but maybe a conference room has that ability to, not have frosted glass or put up curtains or whatever that looks like?
Right. So the biggest thing, right, is we want to make sure that, so in 32 CFR part 2002, so the CUI regulation talks about establishing a single physical barrier to prevent to prevent visual and auditory access to that CUI. So let's say, for example, you have to present in a room that's a conference room that has glass where people can see in. Well, right, take your monitors and turn them away so that the people walking by that glass potentially won't see it. Does it suck? Yes, right, because everybody's probably going to be huddled around a little screen. Or the next step is, getting some curtains, right, putting some type of where not only people can not only see what you guys are displaying CUI on that screen, but potentially not being able to hear it either, overhear those CUI conversations.
Interesting. So like some people are like, oh, I'm just going to put my VDI session up on the TV in the conference room. It's like, what? Let's hold on there for just a second, because to your point, they're going to be able to hear it, the meeting, or anything being played through that if redirection's enabled, which could open up another problem that we actually addressed last week with Bonner or a couple weeks ago. But the video stream itself, right? It's like, you're going to have to probably find a small conference room with ideally no visible entry in, or you're going to your point, Fernando, be huddled in the corner with the laptop screen being like, yep, talking in a whisper, because you don't want people to hear you on the other side of the wall there.
I know one of the examples that the regulators made regarding that single physical barrier was a cubicle environment. And they said with basically in a commingled environment using a cubicle setting. And the examples that they give you is, if someone walks into your cubicle that is not authorized to view CUI, you could trigger a screen share or put any CUI documents away from unauthorized visual access. And if you're going, and to also to be mindful of who are those around you that are not authorized to hear CUI discussions, to save those conversations to be in the appropriate space to have those conversations.
It's going back to, if you've ever worked on the DoD side of the house, a SCIF, or going into a controlled room, right? It's very similar type of behavior. It's just it's, a different kind of cadence than the regular corporate world, right? I mean, everyone has private conversations in private rooms, but you kind of get what we're talking about there. All right, coming down the list, we got some good ones. How would an assessor view a prime using FedRAMP cloud products, Box or Kahua Gov, or soon to be Procore Gov? So out of the gate, I already know this person's in the construction space, AEC space, Procore and Kahua, primarily construction applications, ERP type systems, to store, share, coordinate CUI data within. Can they share CMMC level 1 contracted companies? Oh no, it cut off.
Yeah, it doesn't. How would an assessor view FedRAMP cloud to share, store, coordinate CUI data within? It goes from CUI to level 1.
Yeah, so I'm gonna kind of build a question off of this question. So a prime can use some sort of FedRAMP solution for CUI. Okay, we got that, to share with their supply chain. If it's CUI, that's great. You can share through that mechanism. It does not rule out the contractual flowdown requirement for your sub to also meet those requirements of you for handling that CUI. So that's number one. Number two, if it's level 1 data, if it turns out to be FCI data, then FCI actually doesn't have a FedRAMP requirement. So you don't have to have a FedRAMP cloud instance to share that data downstream, although you could if you're just building out a Gov instance for the sake of it. And if you have more, Mr. 11944, feel free to add on to the rest of your question there.
Yeah, and if for those of you, that kind of brings up another point. We usually run into folks that'll say, well, we're going to implement level 1. And then, once we get level 1 compliant, we'll then progress to level 2. And I said, well, be careful how you do that, because you could say you're going to build level 1 in Microsoft's 365 commercial environment, but you can't just continue on to level 2, because you would have to migrate to either GCC or GCC high to move forward.
It was funny. I was just talking to our marketing team last week about the same thing. I was like, there's going to be a lot of misinformation. 60x% is what of the defense industrial base is what the DoD estimates will have to be level 1. I was like, there's a lot of people that are going to rush towards level 1 and then think they just have to do the uplift of the controls for level 2. And it's it's actually better to go gov cloud of preference, right? GCC high, implement the FAR 15 or CMMC level 1 controls, and then from there grow into your boundary versus having to migrate after you've grown because you've won so much work with your L1 self-attestation, and then have to do migration and larger impact. Because the more you grow, the more pain it causes, the more burden of cost it causes. It's just not good. Yeah, that's a great call out.
Yeah, we call it, if you want to build a house, you got to make sure you pour the concrete down first. And right, best way to do it is pouring down that concrete, that foundational environment that you're going to be in very early on so that you could build it all the way up.
All right, we got a question out from Jeremy here, Fernando. We are being required to provide shared responsibility matrix, which the new word for that, because the DoD likes to align things, is customer responsibility matrix based on the 32 CFR for all tools used. So all of the, I'm assuming MSP tools used. Our C3PO is saying all SRMs need to be aligned with NIST 800-171. Is this a requirement? What do we do if someone will not provide this? So if they're working with an MSP, says we're not going to give you an SRM aligned to 171, which is the equivalent of level 2 for those that might not know, what do they do, Fernando?
Yeah, so I'm looking at right now in the 32 rule, and it talks about an OSA can use an external external service provider that does not process or transmit CUI, but the use of that external service provider, its relationship to the contractor and the services provided are documented in the contractor's SSP and described in the external service provider system description and customer responsibility matrix. So if you're utilizing tools specifically for CUI or even SPAs using those cloud service providers, you're going to need a shared responsibility matrix to determine who's going to be responsible for what of those 800-171 controls.
So basically, if you can't get it, you probably don't need to use them because you're going to have a problem going through your actual assessment. Because the only carve out to that, I think, Fernando, is that if it's a CSP and they're FedRAMP moderate authorized, them in the marketplace is sufficient. If they're FedRAMP moderate equivalent, you've got to see information about that provider. Or if they're an ESP from the sense of like an MSP or MSSP, they've got to have a customer shared responsibility matrix. And there's just no way around that.
Right. And we've seen, I mean, you can get creative with it. I've seen folks try to piece together off like SOC 2 reports, ISO 27001 to try to piece together an SRM. And it is extremely difficult to do that, especially if there's not a one-to-one mapping correlation between whatever cloud service provider to the 800-171 control set.
Oh man, this is getting fun. I got another one for you. Abram, during a joint surveillance assessment, we had to replace LAPS, local admin password. Is it sync? Is that the S? I can't remember, on Windows, with another solution because the C3PO said LAPS was not compliant, but the DIBCAC said it was. Can you talk to this?
Yeah, so we actually use LAPS ourselves, and DIBCAC didn't have a problem with it. So
should a C3PO have a problem with it? Is there any nuance there that I'm unaware of? Because you're cycling the accounts and passwords through LAP, right? And so it's like, I'm trying to figure out why a C3PO wouldn't think that that's compliant.
I don't know.
Okay, maybe Fernando's available for hire next June if you guys are interested. Go ahead and maybe time for a switch there.
I mean, it's just good. It's to me, I like LAPS. It's just good security.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great security baseline. All right, John. If we are on-prem data, can we have a FIPS firewall just for those making a VPN connection and a non-FIPS firewall for day-to-day traffic?
Yeah, so the FIPS validated cryptography, I have to go, I'll go look for it right now, but memory serves me right. FIPS validated cryptography is only for when CUI is going to be transmitted outside of the protected boundary, right? This is why you can't really implement FIPS validated cryptography on a server and then expect it to play nice with some of your like operational technology systems. It tends to break stuff. So that's why you have those alternative physical safeguards to protect that. And it's actually documented in the DoD procurement toolbox. under the cyber FAQs. It's located there. That kind of gives you some additional context to that. So I hope that answers your question.
I always like to tell people it's like there are two ways to protect confidentiality of CUI, which is the goal of CMMC level 2. And that is physical protection, cover sheets, lock boxes, or you shred it, or you have locks on doors and access controls, or cryptography. Those are the two major pieces there. Go ahead, Fernando. You got something to add?
Yeah. Speaking of shredding, so we all saw NIST 888-Rev2 just came out, and it goes from having to have a shredder to shred down by a 1x5 millimeter down to now just a regular shredder will do. The problem is, there's no requirement as to like the certain size that it has to be done anymore. As long as it's shredded, pulverized, incinerated, and there's like 2 other sections in there. As long as it meets one of those 5, it's sufficient. But the problem is that 800-171 Rev 2 and Rev 3 incorporates by reference NIST 888 Rev 1. So we're gonna have to wait for like DoD to come out with a class deviation to basically say this is allowed to go ahead and do this to kind of save some contractors and folks around the board some money buying $1,500 desk side shredders.
Golly, man, we're so close to having victory in certain areas, and then it's like, oh, we got to wait for a class deviation to get an exemption there. Like, all right, that's fun. Follow up. This is the conference room piece. How about if there's non-CUI compliant equipment within a conference room? Is it best to have CUI dedicated conference rooms to reduce risk? Or would you treat those non-CUI assets as like CRMAs? What do you think is the better approach here, Fernando?
How about if there is non-CUI compliant equipment within a conference room? Is it best to have CUI dedicated conference room to? I would probably say so. I mean, especially if there's a risk that some of that non-CUI equipment is going to be processing, storing, or transmitting CUI through it. It's probably best to kind of just take that approach if you're going to do that. And again, right, like this is very limited question here to kind of figure out what kind of equipment they're actually talking about.
Yeah. So if the system is sitting on the same network, it's problematic, right? CRMA, you don't have to have logical or physical separation, but like, so that's kind of a concern. But if it's like, if you have a VTC, like Logitech thing sitting on your desk, but you use an HDMI cable to plug into your TV, that VTC can still sit in there, but the HDMI is what's transmitting directly to the TV. So the VTC would still be out of scope when it comes to something like that. If you have a more specific example, handle 212, please let us know there. And this one is, we had a live stream with Ryan Bonner a couple weeks ago, CUI Hotline. Ryan made the statement that VDI with mic and camera mapped through was still out of scope, specifically to add more language here, if there's no CUI being transmitted over that audio, right? So if it's just redirection, but no CUI, there's a course for it still being an out of scope asset. But once that CUI crosses the border, that's where the problem comes through. Would you agree with that, Fernando?
Yep, I would. Yeah. And by the way, to kind of go back to that last question regarding FIPS, I found it. It's in question 72, answer 72 in the DoD procurement toolbox.
All right. So it's DoDprocurementToolbox.com. It's the longest URL that doesn't end at a .gov. It's like, I guess they just were feeling a little antsy and wanted a .com for that. So that is a DoD website, by the way.
Yeah.
So. All right. I'm going to look through some questions. We got 5 minutes left. Man, we got some good ones. Let's see here. Okay, here's an example back to the conference room. An example would be an OWL that is used for non-CUI meetings for screen sharing and video. It's fine to have the OWL in there as long as it's not processing, storing, or transmitting CUI. If it ever comes in scope of that, that's where the problem would end up being problematic. All right, I'm going to jump around a little bit more here. What recommendation when a CUI asset cannot operate in FIPS mode, Ubuntu 2404, if we can prove that all non-FIPS validated cryptography has been disabled, is that acceptable?
So my question would then ask, right, does that CUI asset going to transmit CUI outside of that protected boundary?
So basically, is that device inside of your physical boundary that has protections on it? And maybe the firewall appliance has FIPS enabled on it, but you're operating within inside the boundary.
Yeah.
That would be a compensating control, basically, a physically compensating control. But if you're taking that laptop with you and you're outside of your boundary, we got some problems.
Yeah, there's some issues there. Yep.
Okay. I'm going to try and find a couple kind of low-hanging fruit ones real quick. NIST 188 Rev 2. I have a memo now both on Rev 1 and Rev 2. Should I keep the memo I wrote for Rev 1 as evidence for our assessment until a class deviation is issued? Do they have to follow Rev 1 for shredding behaviors?
They do.
A class deviation. So
yeah,
still buy the fancy 1x5 printer or shredder.
Yeah.
Until a class deviation is, you cannot follow Rev 2 and be compliant.
Yeah, sadly, because like if you guys go look at 800-171 Rev 2 and Rev 3, it incorporates the NIST 888 Rev 1 by incorporation. So the only way to actually move that is DoD has to come out and say that you guys can use the Rev 2 acceptable methods for media sanitization of CUI.
Nice. Man, it's fun. You're close, Megan, in the sense of you're trying to do the best thing according to the latest publication. This is where compliance and security maybe have a little bit of a tizzy, of a little bit of a fight here.
Yeah,
and this revs documents way faster than the DoD revs regulations. So
yeah, and interestingly enough, I think a couple of weeks ago, so I pointed out CUI in the CUI policy and guidance documents over at the Information Security Oversight Office, and it's document, it's policy 2019-03 that talks about the multi-step destruction process for CUI. So interestingly enough, the agencies were complaining that having one of these NSA approved shredders was expensive. So,
oh my gosh, what?
So, oh yeah. And so they came out with a multi-step destruction standard that if you shred CUI, for example, using a non-NSA approved shredder, but then followed up with a separate destruction, either through like incinerating it or even recycling it, that would meet the multi-step destruction standard. It would be acceptable. However, DoD came out and said that applies to the agencies. That doesn't apply to you as contractors. U.S. contractors are beholden by NIST 888 Rev 1 by incorporation.
Wow. So the DoD just big boyed and said, guys, nice try. Doesn't apply to you. Rev 1, buy the expensive shredder. If I could start a company right now of a CUI compliant shredding organization, I think I'd make a killing right now, Fernando.
Oh, easily.
Just get a little food truck, convert it to a shredding truck. I mean, there we go. All right. One last follow-up. The tools in question are not for CUI, but we're told, this is the SRM question we had. The tools in question are not for CUI. We were told we had to provide them due to using SSO with our company identities. We are completely GCC high and have no on-prem. All CUI is housed in GCC high. So if the tool itself, an external tool, if they're FedRAMP moderate authorized, they're okay just if they're in the marketplace. If they're an ESP like an MSP and they're integrating any kind of security protection assets with security protection data around SSO, for example, that if they're like an SSO provider, they would be in scope to having some sort of share responsibility or FedRAMP moderate equivalence if there is CUI in scope. If there's not CUI in scope, FedRAMP doesn't apply. It's not applicable to just SPAs.
Right.
So
and that was going to be exactly what I was going to say, right? So if it's a CUI asset, if it's a CUI asset or security protection asset, if it's one of those two things, right, and you're using cloud services or even a service provider to manage those, like now at that point, right, a CRM comes into play on how, right, who's got that side of the responsibility for maintaining those controls.
Man, it's interesting because a lot of organizations, I talk to a lot of cloud providers that are trying to just get CMMC certified and not go through the FedRAMP process. And I'm like, I don't think you understand how it works. It's like, yeah, like literally this was this week. It was I won't say the type of organization because it would call them out, but they are involved in the manufacturing industry. And they said, hey, and this is funny, all of our defense manufacturers are saying we have to be CMMC certified. I was like, well, your defense manufacturers don't actually know what's going on because you have to be FedRAMP because they would follow the definition of what a CSP is. Yep. And so Anyway, so going through that, it's like, no, you need not be CMMC certified. You need to be FedRAMP. And if you want to be CMMC certified for the optics of marketing, so you can show both, absolutely. But you're going to waste your money pursuing CMMC first and not FedRAMP, and you're going to end up in some sort of lawsuit at some point where a defense contractor failed their assessment because you said your tool was able to meet the standards and it's not.
100%. So I brought this up a couple of years ago and actually spoke to some of the heads over at FedRAMP to ask them the question, because what was happening was folks were putting their specific tools into a FedRAMP authorized environment. Like let's just pick like AWS, right? Yeah. So they were sticking their tool in AWS, and then they were then using it as a SaaS product for their tool. And I said, no. The infrastructure platform and the software each have to be FedRAMP. There it is right there. That's exactly what I pointed to was the FAQ over at the FedRAMP marketplace.
The first word is no. In the response, it's like, is a SaaS or platform as a service resides on FedRAMP authorized infrastructure like AWS Gov, Azure Gov? Does that mean it's also FedRAMP? No. Yep. It's like, okay, well, I mean, that's fairly straightforward, you know? So, all right, we are at the hour, a couple minutes past. Fernando, thank you for jumping on twice, one to the wrong link I sent you and one to the correct one. It was a joy having you. How do people reach out to you if they want to book assessments or go through any kind of readiness services that you provide? What's the best thing to do?
Just email us at info@cybertechinvestments.com or give us a call at 800-960-8802.
Fantastic. Rock and roll, man. Well, hopefully a lot more successful certifications past the 61 that you have already. It's incredible. Wish everyone well here on the call. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you later.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
See y'all.